The train wheels clacked rhythmically against the tracks as Elizabeth clutched the worn letter in her trembling hands. The paper was soft from countless readings, the ink slightly faded, but the words still promised everything she had dreamed. Of a kind husband seeks a devoted wife for companionship and partnership in building a prosperous ranch in Arizona territory. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We'd love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. She pressed her face against the dusty window, watching the endless expanse of desert roll past. At 23, Elizabeth had already lived through more hardship than most women. Twice her age, the death of her parents from consumption had left her working 16-hour days in a Boston textile mill, barely earning enough to afford a cramped room in a boarding house where rats were her only companions. The mail-order marriage had seemed like divine intervention when she'd seen the advertisement in the newspaper. William Morrison's letters painted pictures of a comfortable adobe house, cattle grazing on vast grasslands, and evenings spent reading by the fireplace. He'd even sent money for her train fare and a simple wedding dress. But as the train pulled into Tucson Station, Elizabeth's stomach churned with nervous energy. The platform was crowded with dusty cowboys, weathered ranchers, and Apache scouts in worn cavalry uniforms. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly, making her wool traveling dress feel like a furnace. Elizabeth Wells? The voice was gruff, impatient. She turned to see a man approaching, and her heart sank. William Morrison was nothing like the gentle rancher she'd imagined. He was tall, but hunched, with greasy hair and clothes that reeked of whiskey and tobacco. His bloodshot eyes looked her up and down, like she was livestock. "That's me," she managed, forcing a smile. "About time. Thought you might have changed your mind." His calloused hand gripped her arm roughly as he guided her toward a battered wagon. "Don't just stand there gawking. Get your things." The 20-mile ride to his ranch was conducted in uncomfortable silence. William took frequent swigs from a flask, mumbling complaints about the heat, the horses, and the damn Apache causing trouble again. Elizabeth tried to make conversation, asking about the ranch, the town, their future together. But his responses were increasingly hostile grunts. The ranch house was a far cry from the comfortable home. Described in his letters, the adobe walls were cracked and crumbling, with gaps that let in dust and scorpions. Inside, dirty dishes were piled in the kitchen, empty bottles covered every surface, and the air was thick with the stench of unwashed clothes and stale alcohol. "This is it," William announced, spreading his arms wide with mock grandeur. "Your new palace." That first night, Elizabeth learned the true nature of her situation. William's idea of marriage was ownership, pure and simple. When she questioned the condition of the house or suggested improvements, he responded with verbal abuse. When she tried to clean or cook, nothing met his standards, and his criticism turned to shouting. "You think you're better than me?" He snarled after she'd served dinner and attempted to discuss plans for improving the property. Some fancy Boston girl who thinks she can come out here and change things. The first blow came without warning, a hard slap across her face that sent her reeling. The shock was worse than the pain, and she touched her stinging cheek with trembling fingers. "That's for looking at me like I'm dirt," William said, his voice deadly calm. "You're my wife now. You'll do as I say when I say it without questions. Understand?" Elizabeth nodded, tears streaming down her face. She was trapped, thousands of miles from anyone who might help her. With no money and nowhere to go, the weeks that followed established a grim routine. William drank heavily every day, his mood growing more volatile with each bottle. Elizabeth walked on eggshells, trying to anticipate his needs, avoiding anything that might set him off. But it was impossible to predict what would trigger his rage. A look, a word, even silence could provoke violence. The isolation was crushing. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and William made it clear that she was not to leave the ranch without his permission. He controlled every aspect of her life, from what she wore to what she ate to when she could sleep. One evening, as William passed out drunk at the kitchen table, Elizabeth sat by the window staring at the vast desert landscape bathed in moonlight. The silence was broken only by his snoring and the distant howl of coyotes. She thought about her old life in Boston, the cramped boarding house room that had seemed like a prison. Now she would have given anything to return to that simple, lonely existence. As she watched the shadows dance across the desert floor, a desperate plan began to form in her mind. The ranch was surrounded by wild Apache territory, land that even William spoke of with fearful respect. It would be dangerous, possibly deadly. But anything was better than this living hell. Elizabeth looked down at her bruised arms, evidence of William's latest drunken rage, and made her decision. Tomorrow night, when he inevitably drank himself into unconsciousness, she would take her chances with the desert and whatever lay beyond those distant hills. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The next evening, William had ridden into town and returned with a bottle of rot-gut whiskey and a foul mood. He'd lost money gambling again, and his anger found its usual target in Elizabeth. After hours of verbal abuse and threats, he finally collapsed at the kitchen table, empty bottle beside him. Elizabeth waited until his snoring filled the house, then moved with careful precision. She wrapped what little bread and dried meat she could find in a dish towel, filled William's old canteen with water, and gathered the few dollars she'd hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Money she'd saved from selling eggs to a passing merchant. Her hands shook as she quietly opened the door and stepped into the cool night air. The moon was only a silver crescent, providing little light as she made her way past the corral toward the desert. Behind her, the ranch house sat in darkness, and she forced herself not to look back. Elizabeth had no clear destination, only that desperate need to put distance between herself and William. She followed what appeared to be an old animal trail heading northeast, toward the distant mountains that stood like dark sentinels against the star-filled sky. The first few hours passed in a haze of adrenaline and determination. Every shadow might be William pursuing her, every sound could be his horse's hooves. But as dawn approached, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold, exhaustion began to take its toll. The Arizona sun rose with merciless intensity, turning the beautiful landscape into a furnace. Elizabeth's traveling dress, already torn and dirty from weeks of abuse, became a suffocating burden.
Ow!
She removed her petticoat and used it to cover her head. But the relief was minimal. By midday, she was rationing the water in careful sips, knowing it might have to last for days. The desert that had looked deceptively smooth from a distance revealed itself to be a maze of arroyos, rocky outcroppings, and thorny vegetation that tore at her clothes and skin. That evening, as temperatures finally began to drop, Elizabeth found a small cave formed by overlapping rocks and collapsed inside. Her feet were blistered and bleeding, her lips cracked and swollen. She allowed herself a tiny sip of water and tried to ignore the growing pangs of hunger. The second day was worse. The water was nearly gone, and hallucinations began to dance. At the edges of her vision, she stumbled through landscapes that seemed to shift and change, following trails that disappeared into nothing. Several times, she thought she heard William's voice calling her name. But when she turned, there was only empty desert. By the third day, Elizabeth could barely walk. She'd finished the last of her water that morning and hadn't eaten in over 24 hours. The sun seemed to press down on her like a physical weight, and she found herself crawling more than walking, following what might have been a game trail toward a cluster of rocks that promised shade. She was lying in the meager shadow of a boulder, drifting in and out of consciousness, when she heard the sound of horses. Fear shot through her exhausted body. William had found her. She tried to hide, pressing herself against the rock, but her movements were clumsy and weak. The voices that reached her weren't speaking English. The words were foreign but somehow musical, flowing like water over stone. Elizabeth forced her eyes open and saw 3 men on horseback approaching slowly. They wore simple clothes, cotton shirts, deerskin leggings, and moccasins. Their long black hair was tied back, and their faces were weathered by sun and wind. Apache, everything. William had told her about the Apache people flooded back. Stories of raids, violence, captivity. She should have been terrified, but she was too weak to feel anything but resigned acceptance. After days of suffering in the desert, perhaps this was simply another form of death. The men dismounted and approached cautiously. The eldest, a man with silver threading through his dark hair and kind eyes, knelt beside her. He spoke softly in his language, then tried broken English. "Water?" he asked, holding up a leather pouch. Elizabeth nodded weakly, and he carefully lifted her head, allowing her to drink. The water was cool and clean, the most beautiful thing she'd ever tasted. The man called to his companions, and they began discussing something in rapid Apache. One of the younger men disappeared and returned with additional supplies. He gave her small pieces of dried meat and made a shelter from blankets to protect her from the sun. Throughout it all, they treated her with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to everything she'd experienced with William. As the sun began to set, the eldest man who she gathered was named Nalnish, helped her onto his horse. They rode slowly through the desert as stars emerged overhead. Heading toward distant firelight that marked their camp, Elizabeth clung to the horse's mane, still not fully believing she was alive. These people, whom William had described as savage enemies, had shown her more kindness in a few hours than her own husband had in weeks. As they approached the Apache camp, she saw women and children emerging from wickiups, their faces curious but not hostile. For the first time since leaving Boston, Elizabeth felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. The Apache camp was unlike anything Elizabeth had imagined. Instead of the hostile war party William had described, she found a thriving community of families going about their evening routines. Children played games around small fires, while their mothers prepared food and mended clothes. Elderly men sat in circles, sharing stories and voices that rose and fell like music. Nolnish brought her to a wickiup where an older woman waited. She introduced herself as Dahana, and though her English was limited, her gestures were unmistakably welcoming. Dahana examined Elizabeth's injuries with gentle hands, clucking sympathetically at the bruises on her arms and the cuts on her feet. "Bad man?" Dahana asked, pointing to the finger-shaped bruises on Elizabeth's wrists. Elizabeth nodded, and Dahana's expression hardened with understanding. She spoke rapidly to another woman who brought healing salves made from desert plants. As they tended to her wounds, Elizabeth realized that these women recognized the signs of abuse, and they condemned it just as fiercely as anyone would. Over the following days, Elizabeth slowly regained her strength. The Apache people, she learned, called themselves the ND, which simply meant the people. Far from the violent savages of William's stories, they were a deeply spiritual community. With complex social structures and profound respect for the natural world, Dahana took Elizabeth under her wing like a mother hen. She taught her to grind mesquite beans into flour, to identify edible plants in the desert, and to weave baskets from sotal fibers. Each lesson came with patience and encouragement, a sharp contrast to William's constant criticism. "You learn quick," Dahana said one afternoon, as Elizabeth successfully completed her first small basket. "Smart woman, strong woman." The words brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. It had been so long since anyone had praised her abilities or recognized her intelligence. Elizabeth also began learning the Apache language from a young woman named Ayana, whose name meant eternal blossom. Ayana was close to Elizabeth's age and had a mischievous sense of humor that gradually coaxed laughter from her new friend. They would sit together in the evenings, Ayana pointing to objects and speaking their names in Apache, while Elizabeth repeated them carefully. Shayana would say, pointing to a bear hide. Shash, Elizabeth would repeat, and Ayana would nod approvingly. The children were perhaps the most healing presence of all. They had no preconceptions about Elizabeth's past or her foreign appearance. They simply accepted her as part of their community, teaching her games, braiding flowers in her hair, chattering to her in rapid Apache that gradually became more comprehensible. A little girl named Itzel, whose bright eyes reminded Elizabeth of her younger sister who had died in the mill accident, became especially attached to her. Itzel would bring Elizabeth smooth stones and interesting feathers. chattering away in Apache while Elizabeth listened and smiled. One evening, as Elizabeth sat with the women around the fire, Dehana began telling a story, though Elizabeth couldn't understand all the words. The emotions were universal. It was a tale about a woman who had lost her way and found a new family among strangers. The other women nodded knowingly, and Elizabeth realized they were talking about her. "We know running," Ayanna explained later in her careful English. "Apache people always running. It's from soldiers, from bad men who want our land. Running to survive, you understand this." Elizabeth did understand. These people had faced their own persecution, their own struggles for survival and dignity. They recognized in her a kindred spirit who had fled to save her own life. As weeks passed, Elizabeth found herself changing in ways she hadn't expected. The constant fear that had defined her marriage began to fade, replaced by a growing confidence. The Apache women valued her contributions to the community and respected her opinions. When she suggested a more efficient way to organize the food storage, they listened and implemented her ideas. Nalnish, the elder who had saved her life, became like a father to her. He taught her about Apache traditions, about their deep connection to the land, and about the importance of family, not just blood relations, but the family you choose.
Apache.
In Apache culture, he explained through Ayanna's translation, family extended. Beyond biological connections to include anyone who shared your struggles and supported your growth. "Blood family is accident of birth," Nolnish said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "Chosen family is decision of heart." Elizabeth had found her chosen family among the NDI. These people had given her something William never could: unconditional acceptance, respect, and love. They had seen her at her weakest and most desperate, and they had chosen to save her, heal her, and make her one of their own. But even as Elizabeth flourished in her new life, she couldn't completely forget the threat that William represented. Sometimes, in quiet moments, she would scan the horizon with worried eyes, knowing that his pride and possessiveness wouldn't let him simply accept her disappearance. He would see her escape as theft, the theft of his property. And William Morrison was not a man who forgave perceived wrongs. Still, surrounded by her new family and growing stronger each day, Elizabeth began to believe that she might actually have found safety and happiness in this unexpected place. She was learning to become the woman she had always been meant to be: strong, capable, and free. 2 months had passed since Elizabeth's escape when the riders appeared on the horizon. She was gathering medicinal plants with Ayanna and little Itzel when they spotted the dust cloud approaching the camp. Even from a distance, Elizabeth recognized the slouched posture of the lead rider, and her blood turned to ice. "William," she whispered, "the second day was worse." The water was nearly gone, and hallucinations began to dance at the edges of her vision. She stumbled through landscapes that seemed to shift and change, following trails that disappeared into nothing. Several times she thought she heard William's voice calling her name. But when she turned, there was only empty desert. By the third day, Elizabeth could barely walk. She'd finished the last of her water that morning and hadn't eaten in over 24 hours. The sun seemed to press down on her like a physical weight, and she found herself crawling more than walking, following what might have been a game trail toward a cluster of rocks that promised shade. Ayanna immediately understood the danger. She grabbed Itzal's hand and spoke rapidly in Apache, sending the child running toward the camp to alert the others. Elizabeth stood frozen, watching as William and 2 other men, rough-looking cowboys she recognized from the saloon in town, rode steadily toward the Apache camp. "Come," Ayanna urged, tugging at Elizabeth's arm. "We go to camp. Warriors protect." But Elizabeth shook her head. She had learned enough Apache to understand that William's arrival with armed men could spark violence that would endanger everyone in the camp. Her new family had already risked so much by taking her in. "No," she said firmly. "This is my fight. I won't let them hurt anyone because of me." By the time they reached the camp, the entire community was mobilizing. The Apache warriors had emerged. From their wiki-ups, weapons ready, while the women and children gathered in protective groups. Nalnish stood at the center, his weathered face calm but alert. William and his companions halted just outside the camp, their horses dancing nervously. Even from across the clearing, Elizabeth could see that William was drunk. His face was flushed red, and he swayed slightly in his saddle. "I know you savages got my wife," he shouted, his words slurred, but carrying clearly across the silent camp. "That's my property you're hiding, and I want her back." Nalnish stepped forward, speaking. "In careful English, you're not welcome here. Go." William laughed harshly and pulled a rifle from his saddle. "I ain't going nowhere without what's mine, Elizabeth. I know you're here, you ungrateful whore. Come out now, or these redskins are going to pay for hiding you." Elizabeth felt Dahana's hand on her shoulder, trying to hold her back, but she gently removed it. Her heart was pounding, but her mind was clear. For weeks, these people had taught her about courage, about standing up for family, about fighting for what was right. Now it was her turn to protect them. She stepped into the clearing, and William's face twisted into a cruel smile. "There she is. Look at you living like an animal with these savages. Did you think I wouldn't find you? Did you think you could just run away from me?" "I'm not going back with you, William," Elizabeth said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Our marriage is over." "Marriage?" William spat. "You think you can decide when our marriage is over? You're my wife, bought and paid for, and you'll do as I say." Raised his rifle, pointing it directly at her chest. "Now get over here before I lose my patience." The Apache warriors tensed, hands moving to their weapons, but Nalnish held up, a hand keeping them still. He understood that this was Elizabeth's moment to choose her own fate. "I said no," Elizabeth repeated, taking a step forward instead of back. "You don't own me, William. You never did. I'm not property to be bought and sold. The hell you ain't." William's voice rose to a roar. "I paid good money for you, and I'll be damned if I let some Indian steal what's mine." "These people didn't steal me," Elizabeth said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "They saved me. They showed me what real family looks like, what love and respect actually mean. You were killing me, William, slowly, piece by piece, and they gave me back my life." Behind her, she could hear Ayana translating her words. For the others, she felt the strength of their support flowing through her like a warm current. William's face turned even redder, and he cocked his rifle. "You come with me right now, or I start shooting your Indian friends, starting with that old man?" It was the wrong threat to make. Something inside Elizabeth snapped, not with fear, but with protective fury. These people had shown her more kindness in 2 months than William had in their entire marriage. She would not let him harm them. "If you want me," she said, walking slowly toward him, "then you deal with me. Leave them out of this." "It's more like it," William sneered, lowering his rifle slightly. "Knew you'd see sense." But as Elizabeth approached, she bent down and picked up a baseball-sized rock from the ground. William was so focused on his victory that he didn't notice until it was too late. Elizabeth hurled the stone with all her strength, striking William squarely in the chest. He toppled backward off his horse, hitting the ground hard. His rifle flew from his hands, landing several feet away. His 2 companions started to raise their weapons, but found themselves facing a dozen Apache warriors with arrows nocked and ready. The odds had shifted dramatically, and they seemed to realize it. William struggled to his feet, gasping and holding his chest. You can't. I'll have the law on you. I'll bring the cavalry." The cavalry won't care about a drunk who comes on to Apache land threatening people," Elizabeth said. "And neither will the law when they hear about how you've been treating." Your wife Nalnish stepped beside Elizabeth, his presence both protective and authoritative. "You go now," he said to William, "not come back. Woman choose new family. You're not welcome." William looked around at the ring of Apache warriors, at Elizabeth standing tall and unafraid beside Nalnish, at his own men who were clearly ready to abandon him rather than fight a losing battle. His face contorted with rage and humiliation. "This ain't over," he snarled at Elizabeth. "You can't hide forever." "I'm not hiding," Elizabeth replied. "I'm home." William glared at her for a long moment, then stumbled toward his horse. He hauled himself into the saddle, his movements clumsy with drink and pain. With a final curse, he spurred his horse away. From the camp, his companions following quickly behind. As the dust settled, Elizabeth felt the tension leave her body all at once. She had faced her demon and emerged victorious, not through violence, but through courage and the strength she had found in her chosen family. Dahana was the first to reach her, wrapping her in a fierce embrace. "Brave woman," she said in English. "Very brave." One by one, the other members of the tribe approached, offering words of support and pride. Little Itzel ran up and hugged Elizabeth's legs, chattering excitedly in Apache. "What is she saying?" Elizabeth asked Ayana, laughing through her tears. "She says you are true Apache now," Ayana translated with a grin. "You fought for family. You are one of us." As the sun set over the desert that evening, Elizabeth sat with Nalnish overlooking the camp. Children's laughter echoed from below, and the smell of cooking food drifted up on the evening breeze. "You think he'll come back?" Elizabeth asked. Nalnish considered the question carefully. "Weak men like him, they are like dust devils. Make much noise, but blow away when they meet strong wind. You're a strong wind now." Elizabeth nodded, feeling the truth of his words. She was no longer the frightened, desperate woman who had fled into the desert. She had found her strength, her family, and her home. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the courage and love that the Apache people had taught her in the distance. A coyote howled, and Elizabeth smiled. It no longer sounded lonely to her. It sounded like freedom,